Hello there everybody, this is Dan Calloway coming at you again, and I want to do a follow-on video to a previous video that I did that demonstrated the use of PHP and HTML for web-based applications to access a MariaDB database created in PHP MyAdmin, then using the PHP to access the database, connect to it, and then to update the database via a query. And that's a video that I did previously. What I wanted to do is go back to that and show you something that I didn't talk about in that video, and that is to talk about the CSS file that we connected to in that demonstration. And so let me get back, let me go up on Kate here. This is my text editor, and I've got the files opened up here. The HTML file for add salesperson, addsalesperson.php file, and then the sample CSS file. If you go out to the HTML and the PHP file, let me look at that first. I'll show you that the link tag that we used here in the head on the HTML file, and it's also incorporated into the PHP file here. Let me scroll up a little bit, and you can see it's there as well in the head tag portion. So let's come back to the HTML file. Notice we have link relative is equal to style sheet. The type is text/CSS. And then this is an H reference to, and this is called a relative reference to the sample.css file, which means that that file, sample.css, must be located in the same folder where the HTML file and the PHP file are residing as well. If that's not the case, it won't find it, and it won't render the attributes, the changes to the attributes associated with the CSS file for these files, and so you won't get any rendering there for those for changes made by this file. So let's go back to this file and look at it, and we'll talk about this file, and I'll tell you how it's constructed and what impact it has on the HTML file and the PHP file or any other file on your website that references it. And by the way, before we do that, let me say that we don't have to necessarily reference it in the way that we have here. I chose to do it in what's called a relative reference, as I said, but you can do an absolute reference, which means you have a URL that points to a website, basically website address, out on the web, could be halfway around the world on a server somewhere, to that file. Doesn't have to be even on the same server, same geographic location as your website, which could contain hundreds of thousands of pages. Alright, so it can be what's called an absolute reference as well. And then you could have an inline CSS, which means you change the CSS in the web page itself for a 1 or 2 pages, and that doesn't affect any other page in your website, for instance. Alright, you can do it that way. So there are 3 ways of doing it. So let's go back out to the sample.css file and let's take a look at it. Now the CSS file is basically just a flat text file which contains 2 components, or actually 3 components. Okay, the first component is called the selector, and the selector corresponds to an HTML tag. Now we're using HTML5, so there's a body tag, there's an H1 tag, an H2 tag, all the way up to H7. There's a P for a paragraph tag. There's a p.alert for a paragraph tag with a alert class equals alert. There's a table tag. There's a TD for table definition. Dot center, which means that it is a center class. There's a select tag for a drop-down menu, and there's an option for a drop-down menu as well in this particular file. Okay, and that's the extent of this file. Now, your CSS file does not have to contain every HTML tag that your web pages use necessarily. It could be used from another site and then just appended or modified in some way. For instance, on the HTML tag, you notice here we have an H2 selector on the CSS file. We do not have an H2 tag anywhere in this HTML file, nor do we have an H2 tag anywhere in this PHP file. Alright, so you don't have to necessarily use it, but it should be there if it is used. Okay, so on the left is your selector, so we have a body selector, and then there's a space followed by a curly brace, and inside that curly brace is what's called a property. Okay, so we have the background property of the body selector, followed by a colon, and then there is a value. So we have selector, curly brace, property, colon, value. And the white is the value associated with background. So it means that for every reference to a body tag on your HTML file or PHP file, that background will have a value of white. So it'll have a white background. And you'll notice if we go out here on the web to the file itself, to the HTML file, it does have a white background. All right. All right, so let's go back to the CSS file. Let's look at another one of these. We do have an H1 selector, H1 tag on the HTML page. So we have an H1 selector here on the CSS file itself, followed by space and a curly brace. And then we have the first property. The first property is the font family. All right, so it's the font family followed by colon. And then the values associated with the font family are Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif in that order. Okay. What that means is that when the website is rendered on the web, if your particular browser can render an Arial font, then it will be the font that's used for the font family property of the H1 selector. All right. If your particular system does not have the Arial font loaded, but does have the Helvetica font loaded as part of its fonts, then it will ignore the Arial and will jump to the second value, which is Helvetica, okay, for the font family property. If the Helvetica is not available, then it will go to the third one, which is the sans serif, okay. And so that's what that means there. So these are three values taken in this order of precedence. All right. If you have more than one property within the curly brace, then you follow that first property by a semicolon. And then the second property here that we're using for the H1 tag is the font size property. All right. So it's followed by a colon, and then the font size is designated at 18 points. All right. Then that particular property rather, we have a third property inside, or actually four properties here. We have another property here in the H1 selector, and so it's followed by a semicolon, and we come to another property called color, whose value is red. All right. Then we have a semicolon that separates that to the next property, which is the font weight. So this is the thickness, if you will, of the font that's used, whichever one gets selected here. And so the font weight's value is bold. So that means that any H1 tag showing up on the HTML page or the PHP pages on your site will bear a bold font weight. Okay? Now, when the last property is designated, you must follow that with a semicolon, even though there is no other property showing. And then you follow that and close that particular selector here with the closed curly brace. All right, and then follow on down, and you have one of these for every one that you want to designate on your website. Now, I will not discuss the p.alert and the td.center because those are special, and I don't have anything to show you on this particular these two pages that I have because I don't use them. But those are classes of the paragraph tag and the class of the td tag, which is the table data tag, or table definition it's referred to. All right, so let's take a look at the HTML page. The HTML page does use an H1 selector here, or H1 tag rather, which is corresponds to the H1 selector on the CSS file. It does have a paragraph tag, several of them, all right, and so we do have that. I don't think there's a table select. Yes, there is. There's a table selector here, so that means that we have some things being changed here in the CSS file that represent the table tag that we have right here in the HTML page. Okay, so let's go back out to the website and let's take a look at the file itself. This is the HTML file called New Sales Staff Entry Form. Okay, if you remember from the previous video. And you'll notice that the H1 tag here is being used to present the new sales staff entry form. Because if I go back out to here, we have the H1 tag new sales staff entry form here. So it's CSS on the CSS page. The H1 selector has for the font family, we have the Arial. It's picking up the Arial. Okay. And its font weight is bold and its color is red, and so the color property is red, and so that's why it appears red on the page here. So let's go back out and look at it. So that's why that's in red. Alright, okay, so if we want to change that for every page, let's assume now for a moment that we don't have just the 2 pages on our website, but let's say we have 17,000 pages that use the H1 tag. All right, on its HTML page or PHP page. That means that if we wanted to change this, so now we change it from red to say blue, that would require us to go out and change that on 17,000 pages, which is an administrative burden. It's basically impossible. It would take a long time if you did it. And so what we're going to do instead is we're going to go out to the CSS file, and we're going to go to the H1 selector, and where the color property is red, we're just going to simply change that to blue. So let's make that blue. Okay. Alright, and then we're going to save the file. Alright, and then we're going to go back out to the web, and in the Chromium browser, to refresh the page, you can hold the Shift key down, hit the F5 key, function key on the keyboard. And you'll notice that it changes the color of the H1 tag presentation. It's being controlled by that H1 tag in HTML5 so that it's a blue color. All right. If we go out now to, if we create a new entry rather, let's look at the PHP My Admin interface and look at the personnel table. The last employee ID that we used was 12363. So let me go back and use 12364. So let's do a 12364, and let's use a name of Mike Spivey. Okay, and then when I hit the submit, it's going to render the PHP result back to us. We should see a blue heading instead of a red one. Okay. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. And the reason for that is because if we go back out to the editor and look at the PHP page, we see that the H1 tag on that page here for the heading, if we have to come down to find the heading here, it's being printed out actually. So here the H1 tag, this is injected HTML code, by the way. Add a new personnel record, picks up as blue color because that's the value of the property color on the CSS file. And so the sample.css that it references has for the H1 selector the color property of a blue value now. Alright. And then if we wanted to change one other thing, let's say the TD, which is the table definition center, let's change the property text align from center to right. So instead of centering the table data, it should push it to the right justification. Alright, and so let's click on File, and let's click on Save. To save that file, you must save the file each time, but you only have to save it once. And so we need to go back now to here, and back to the parent, well, to the HTML file again to refresh the screen. I'm going to change this in a moment. I'll show you. Let's do a new record. 12365, and let's add a new record. Donnie Brown. Okay, and let's click submit. Alright, and you'll notice that here on the table, if we had the table frame being shown, it would show that this has now been pushed to the right instead of centered, and I probably should have changed that for you so we could see it. So let me go back and let me change, let's see, let's go back and change the table that is created here from a table border of 0 to a table border of 1 in the file. Alright, and we leave the sample.css alone. Let's go out and save all. Okay, and let's go back to the website and let's refresh. I don't think we can refresh the page on this PHP file, but we'll give it a try. I think it's going to render an error if we do that. Yeah, so we can't do that. So let's go back out and let's pull up the form again. Let's just put in a new record. 1, 2, 3, 6. Let's say 6, 9. And let's add Martha Stewart. Okay, and submit. And okay, so now the data is actually being pushed to the right here in this table. Alright, so from the CSS file. I believe it's being pushed to the right anyway. Let's see. Or was it to the left? We have it set up. Text align should be right. And it looks like the text alignment's to the left here, so it didn't seem to work. I'm not sure why. Let's do a shift F5 just to make sure that we have a no, we can't do that. Cancel. There we go. So I'll have to figure out what's going on there. It didn't seem to shift it to the right. Maybe there's not enough room, not really sure. But anyway, so that demonstrates how the CSS file controls various aspects of your website by changing the property values associated with a particular selector that correspond to the HTML5 tags that you use on your website. Okay. One other thing I did want to show you before I leave is one of the things I wanted to do was add, I've got it right now, I've got it commented out on the HTML page, and that is that I am adding a link back to the form once the data is presented from the PHP file. So let me do a file save here on this file. So I'm altering the HTML file. Alright, and so when I go back out to the web, if I add another record, let me go back again and back again, go back to the HTML file. Notice I've got to clear the form here. Okay, and so if I start adding information and I make a mistake, I can come down and actually clear the form, which I couldn't do before. All right, and then on the PHP side, if I want to have a link going back to that page, so that I don't have to keep going back arrow all the time, I can go to the PHP file here, and I can come down, and inside the tag here after this last statement, all right, I can add another print statement here, which it's a print function, and so I've got a paragraph tag, and I got an anchor tag, a href, and I'm going to do an equals, and I'm going to use I've got double quotes appears here. There we go. There we are. And so it's going to be href equals, and so in order to make sure that PHP doesn't confuse that with the closing double quote, I'm going to use an escape character, which is a backward slanting line, and then the double quote rather, and then that's going to be return, the file name rather, which is add sales person.html. All right, and then close the equals, double quote rather. There we go. And then close the tag, return to form, and then in the anchor tag, and then in the paragraph tag, double quote, and then in the print statement. Okay, and so it looks like that. All right, and so now let's save the file here, and then go back out on the web, and I'll show you that I now have. Let's go back out to here, and well, let's actually add another record, which is 12370, let's say. Okay, and first name Brian Whitaker. Okay, now I'm going to submit this, and notice that I have now a return to form link down below that I didn't have before, so I don't have the back arrow. I can just hit the return to form, and it takes me back to the form again. Okay, so this has been a demonstration of the CSS form, or file rather, and how the CSS file called sample.css that we referenced in this presentation controls various aspects of your site based on how you change the property values on the selector that correspond to the HTML tags on your web pages. Have a nice day.